Walt Disney stares intently at the storyboard while uniformed military officers surround him. It's not a scene from a fairy tale, but a classified Pentagon briefing room in 1943. The man who created Mickey Mouse is designing something far more sinister. Propaganda films featuring Donald Duck as a Nazi soldier, psychological warfare animations, and military training videos on how to effectively kill the enemy. His smile, the same one seen in wholesome publicity photos, doesn't waver as he presents a cartoon sequence showing Japanese civilians being dehumanized as vermin. "Gentlemen," he says calmly, "animation isn't just for children. It's the perfect weapon to program the American mind." The beloved uncle of American childhood wasn't just creating magic, he was engineering consent for a nation at war. The image from the briefing room hangs in the air for a moment, harsh and out of place. It startles because it does not fit the picture most people carry in their heads when they hear the name Disney. That jarring scene is absent from the stories taught in classrooms, replayed in puff-piece documentaries, and printed in authorized biographies. Now, before we start pulling at threads, let's remember the version everyone knows, the neat, comforting narrative that has been served to generations. We were taught a story with a familiar beat. A farm boy from Missouri, hungry for something larger than the life offered to him, who followed talent and stubbornness until he remade an industry. Walt Disney as archetype, the self-made visionary, the resilient entrepreneur, the man who turned a doodled mouse into an empire. You learned it like a bedtime story. He lost a studio, he bounced back, he drew a mouse in a garage, he invented synchronized sound with Steamboat Willie, he risked everything on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in One, and decades later he built a park that made childhood tangible. That is the official arc, simple, moral, and deeply consoling. Frame 1. Origin. Picture a sepia-toned Midwestern street. A young Walt drawing in spare hours while a small-town band marches past. Textbooks compress the facts into tidy lines. Modest upbringing, early talent, relentless work ethic. In official images, the painful failures are soft-focused. Bankruptcy becomes early hardship. Supportive relatives become the fairy godparents of the dream. And the messy business relationships that helped him get started are recast as serendipity. The effect is swift, an origin myth that suggests pure grit rather than networks, investments, or privilege. Quote the typical museum placard voice, Walt Disney, a visionary whose belief in imagination and optimism changed how the world sees childhood. It reads like a sermon. It is round, confident, and polished. It removes friction. It offers an origin you can admire without investigating who provided capital, whose labor did the work, or who profited when the brand became global. Frame 2. The Golden Innovations. This is where the myth hits its crescendo. Steamboat Willie is presented as the flash of genius that transformed animation overnight. Snow White is framed not as a risky corporate gamble, but as an act of brave artistry that saved family entertainment. Fantasia is remembered as daring, experimental, elevated in an attempt to fuse high culture with popular form. In school and on commemorative plaques, these moments are about invention, courage, and unalloyed creative ambition. A synthetic line from an educational documentary. Against the odds, Walt proved that animation could be a serious art form. He refused to let commercial pressures kill imagination. The line is satisfying because it frames Walt as a bulwark against the cynicism of commerce. It positions him as an artist first and an entrepreneur second. Frame 3. Disneyland and the American Dream made physical. The narrative image is irresistible. A smiling man unveils a theme park built from nostalgia, optimism, and a desire to build a better world, a place where families come together and history is sanitized into comforting vignettes. The happiest place on earth becomes less a tagline and more a civic promise. Orderly, clean, apolitical. School tours, travel articles, and home videos reinforce the idea that Disney curated an idealized America Main Street without strikes, westward expansion without dispossession, childhood without complexity. Here is a third official voice, the civic plan rhetoric. Disneyland is an expression of American values, innovation, family, and free enterprise. It places the brand in the role of national emissary, an emblem not just of entertainment, but of what America is supposed to be. Those three frames, origin, innovation, and Disneyland, are repeated until they feel incontrovertible. They form a comfortable coherence. Conflicts are smoothed. Difficulties are framed as obstacles overcome by pluck. Labor disputes are footnotes. Messy alliances are footnotes. And the wartime collaborations and political entanglements are either omitted entirely or treated as unfortunate blips on an otherwise heroic career. The version official culture sells is tidy because it has to be. It turns a complex life into a usable symbol. It is the kind of history that functions well on plush museum walls, in corporate advertising, and in school curricula. It comforts, it sells, and it erases inconvenience. Who benefits from this sanitization? Start with the obvious, the Disney Corporation. A myth of genius and benevolence protects brand value. It reduces reputational risk when controversial issues arise. When a multinational corporation depends on goodwill across markets, a polished founder myth is a strategic asset. Then consider institutions that profit when culture appears apolitical. Governments interested in a friendly global image, corporate sponsors who underwrite projects and want association with wholesomeness, and conservative commentators who prefer a national story without moral ambiguity. But it goes beyond direct economic advantage. The sanitized narrative is useful to ideologies that need a model of national character: clean, moral, uncomplicated. Religious institutions using family-oriented messaging, political actors deploying nostalgic nationalisms, and tourism industries selling a feel-good heritage all find material in the official story. In short, the comfortable version of Walt Disney serves power. It generates soft power, it underwrites a commercial empire, and it quiets dissent. Visually, the myth is crafted carefully. Think of museum films. Gentle music, slow shots of an elderly Walt with an amiable smile, archival footage edited to suggest continuous progress. The camera never lingers on angry faces of striking workers. It treats complex events like labor conflicts as small bumps on a smooth road. The result is persuasive. Repetition makes acceptability. 2 or 3 synthetic official quotes anchor the public memory. Walt taught us to dream. His is the story of American perseverance. Disneyland is a place where problems do not belong. These lines shape what people remember and what they notice. They narrow the field of inquiry. The official narrative also wields technical tools: authorized biographies, controlled archives, curated exhibits, PR machines, and legal barriers, copyright and trademark enforcement. These are not incidental. They are deliberate methods of narrative maintenance. Authorized biographers often work with close access and implicit constraints. Archives labeled private can stay inaccessible to scholars. Films are redacted or presented in selective cuts. The machinery of a corporation becomes the machinery of memory. How does that feel when you encounter it for the first time? You may recognize the episodes on a commemorative wall, nod along, and feel grateful for stories that reassure. You learned that Walt was singularly responsible for joyful invention and that his aims were pure. And then if you step closer, the seams begin to show, because the official story depends on a great deal of omission. You learned it like this: a tidy arc, a set of heroic episodes, and a single moral point. You were charmed, and perhaps you still are. That charm is part of the power of the myth. But charm can also be a mask. The story is, for a moment, too good to be true. There are cracks beneath the varnish, small at first, then widening. And those cracks are not incidental. They lead straight to rooms where the public face and private actions do not line up. If you have stayed this far into the video, they are not dramatic revelations that arrive fully formed. They are small inconsistencies and absences that, strung together, make the official building unstable. In this section, we put those first cracks under a magnifying lens. We will group them and examine each cluster, moving from the minor discrepancies to the contradictions that make the legend hard to sustain. Start with the comfortable origin. The official story foregrounds scarcity and grit. The inconvenient truth is more complicated. Walt Disney did grow up in a Midwest that shaped him, but he was not a grinder who made everything from scratch. Family records and local accounts show that his upbringing was comfortable in ways the myth omits. Relatives with stable businesses, connections to local patrons, and access to institutions that mattered. The garage startup image is cinematic shorthand. In the record, early partnerships and financiers appear with regularity. That doesn't negate the work or the imagination, but it reframes the beginning from solitary genius to networked opportunity. Think of a scene in a documentary. A camera pulls back from an old photograph of a modest house and reveals a ledger handwritten entries that include loans, patrons, and introductions. It's less romantic, but far more useful for understanding how an enterprise actually scales. The first crack is a matter of context. Who quietly supplied the capital and the introductions that allowed a nascent studio to survive? Who benefited from those early arrangements? These are not idle questions. They point to an ecosystem that the myth elides. Next, examine the political contradictions. Publicly, Disney cultivated an image of wholesome patriotism. Privately, documents recovered from personal papers and witness testimony show active collaboration with government agencies. From 1940 onward, Walt was not merely a patriotic entertainer. He engaged with federal officials. He offered lists of names to investigators. He hosted lunches with agents. And he accepted an office within government space. For decades, historians have debated motives: fear, genuine belief, opportunism, but the fact of regular communication with the FBI and other authorities is a matter of record. That collusion sits uneasily with the image of an apolitical man who simply wanted to make children smile. Imagine an archival shot, a corridor lined with file cabinets, a typed memo with J. Edgar Hoover's letterhead, a note that references industry concerns. These are the artifacts of an extended relationship between a cultural producer and a security state. It is not necessary to brand every action as villainous. Motives are layered and ambivalent. But the presence of those files forces us to reconcile a public persona with behind-the-scenes activity. How did this relationship shape what the studio produced? What did government officials ask for? And what did Disney offer in return? The timing of creative milestones also offers a pattern worth noting. Snow White's release precedes America's increasing global engagement. Fantasia arrives just as military-industrial power consolidates. Disneyland opens amid Cold War anxieties. Correlation is not causation, but patterns invite inquiry. Were these coincidences or strategic alignments? Consider how state needs and private enterprise found common ground. Animation, with its emotional simplicity and wide reach, proved ideal for messaging. The studio's timing, not merely artistic, but also fiscal and logistical, often matched national priorities. A third cluster of cracks concerns labor. The studio system that produced the early Disney films depended on a workforce paid less and credited far less than the finished product suggested. Animation was a team sport because it had to be, and yet the public story centers on a single face. Look at strike records, payroll logs, and interviews with former employees. There is a consistent picture of discontent, long hours, inadequate pay, and a culture of intimidation. The famous 1941 strike is not a footnote. It is a moment when the myth and reality collided publicly. The official narrative typically collapses that event into difficulties with staff, But contemporary reports and archival letters reveal a harsher reality: management hostility, threats, and the use of outside forces to break labor organizing. A short scene to imagine. A winter morning outside the studio gates. Picket signs in the hands of exhausted animators. Managers in suits watching through glass. A sympathetic newspaper columnist writes about unfair treatment, while a corporate press release frames the same day as temporary inconveniences. That dissonance matters because foundations of the myth depend on hiding the human cost of production. Race and representation form another set of fissures. Disney films contain images and scenes that, viewed today, are jarring. From racially stereotyped characters to caricatured depictions of foreign peoples, many classic films include elements that perpetuated harmful ideas. The Crows in Dumbo, the Siamese Cats in Lady and the Tramp, these are not isolated lapses. They reflect broader cultural assumptions of their time, but they also reveal choices about which images to amplify and which to ignore. The studio rarely acknowledged these harms in public for decades. Instead, such imagery was folded into folklore as innocuous character choices. The effect was the normalization of prejudice tropes through beloved media. Another concrete crack: the forgotten animators. Names like Ub Iwerks, who actually did much of the early technical animation work, are underemphasized in the popular story. Studio credits, corporate histories, and museum displays privilege one face, while countless contributors remain anonymous or minimized. Look at payroll sheets and patent filings. The creative labor is there, but so is a pattern of unacknowledged contribution. The myth of a lone genius obscures the collaborative reality and facilitates the consolidation of authorship and, with it, control and wealth in a single family. Then there is the wartime pivot, the moment the studio shifted gear and produced content explicitly for military and government purposes. After Pearl Harbor, sound stages converted to military uses, and the workforce shifted to training films, technical diagrams, and psychological operations. Over 400 wartime films passed through the studio, many commissioned and distributed with government involvement. This was not a minor commercial detour. It was an intense period during which the studio's capacities were repurposed for state goals, to instruct servicemen, to visualize strategic theories, and to stoke homefront morale. Films like Education for Death and Der Fuhrer's Face are stark in their intention. They are propaganda, not mere entertainment. Imagine the atmosphere: assembly lines of animators turning out reels that would be shown on bases and in newsreels, rooms where military officers reviewed cartoons for psychological effect, and Walt himself meeting with officials to critique tone and emphasis. The images that resulted were effective and brutal in consequence. They contributed to dehumanization campaigns that helped mobilize popular support for strategic bombing and other wartime policies. The moral problem is not merely that these films existed. It is that techniques honed in this period bled into peacetime practice, smoothing the path for later uses of entertainment as persuasion. A further thread runs through the post-war era: testimony before congressional committees. Walt's cooperation with loyalty investigations, his naming of suspected radicals, and the provision of studio material to investigators are matters that complicate the public image. He was not a distant celebrity caught up in politics. He was an active participant in anti-communist purges. That involvement helped reshape the industry and the careers of many colleagues. The result for culture was chilling in two ways: immediate personal ruin for those accused, and structural, a narrowing of permissible ideas in mainstream entertainment. As these fissures accumulate, a pattern emerges. The myth silences are often strategic. Omissions of labor conflict, of financiers, of political collaboration are not random. They are the product of deliberate choices about which documents to display, which stories to tell, and which to subpoena into obscurity. Consider the physical archive itself: boxes labeled sensitive, reels stored away with restricted access, and corporate counsel who control researchers' permissions. The preservation of legacy required curation as much as creation. There are also absences that feel like deliberate erasure. What comes next is not simply a portrait of failings, but a reconstruction of how those alliances worked in practice. If the myth was carefully polished, who wielded the polish, and for what purpose? The answer will change the way you see the smiling face on the posters. Behind the smiling portraits and the softened anecdotes, the studio's corridors had a different rhythm. The sound stages that audiences imagined as warm. Communal workshops were often cold and clipped in memory. Fluorescent lights, concrete floors, quick footsteps, the hush of men and women bending over light tables. Inside that hush lived Walt Disney in a way few biographical vignettes allow. Restless, exacting, and sometimes terrifying. Animators who would later give interviews remembered the silence before a critique as a physical thing. Walt would stand near a desk, hands clasped behind his back, watching a pencil line move. Then he would speak, not always about art. Too sentimental, he might say, or not believable. He could make a room feel like a courtroom with a glance. The same people who described him as an inspiration also described nights spent staring at ceilings, bullied into reworking scenes until they matched an image in his head. Creativity at Disney often meant being remade in Walt's image. But temperament only tells half the story. Less visible was the network he operated inside. Lunches in discreet hotel rooms with intelligence officers, private phone calls to military liaisons, introductions to industrial magnates who later became sponsors. Those were not happenstance meetings. They were moves on a chessboard. Walt learned very early that animation could open doors that other media could not. A cartoon that made children laugh could, with a few shifts in tone, make soldiers rehearse procedures, make civilians accept shortages, or make audiences view foreign peoples as caricatures rather than neighbors. Consider a Tuesday in 1943. Morning, storyboard reviews, jokes about timing, a debate over a gag. Afternoon, a car ride to an office downtown where men in uniforms sit behind heavy desks. Walt speaks for an hour on rhythm, on how a turn of the head communicates threat. He sketches a handful of frames on a pad. Those frames, which in other hands would become a slapstick sequence in a short, are here retooled. A training reel on how to spot an enemy submarine. An animated sequence clarifying the mechanics of aircraft navigation. The artist's touch is the same. The intent has shifted. Walt's dislike of unions was also conditioned by networks of loyalty and fear. When animators organized in 1941, the strike did not occur in a vacuum. It reverberated through dinner tables, through investor anxieties, through the private conversations Walt had with studio backers. He saw departure of talent as betrayal, not merely a business risk. In private correspondence and later testimony, his language about agitators and outside influences borrows from the political lexicon of the era, a lexicon that connected labor unrest to subversion. Whether he genuinely feared communist infiltration or whether he used that fear to protect his business is a debate. What matters for the record is that he framed dissent in existential terms. He mobilized legal counsel, he cut off pay, and in several instances he invited external authorities into disputes that might otherwise have been handled internally. The studio's internal culture amplified personal contradictions. Teams were arranged in hierarchies so rigid you could feel the lines of command on the floor plan. A gagman would pass a drawing to an inker, who would pass it to a checker, who would pass it upward until it arrived at Walt's desk. Credit did not travel backward the same way. Iworks and others who did foundational work were often placed in footnotes of later stories. Payroll sheets and studio memos show names that vanish from museum plaques. The idea of a single auteur was useful. It condensed complexity into an emblem people could celebrate. It also freed the company to centralize profits and control narratives about authorship. This was a man who could be generous funding education programs, supporting artists in certain ways and ruthless in others. He cultivated patrons and politicians with the same careful calculus he used for story arcs. When a government contract promised both income and legitimization, he accepted. When a potential sponsor could underwrite a pavilion at a park, he cultivated them. Those relationships rewired the studio from within. Creative decisions began to account for more than plot dynamics. They accounted for diplomatic sensitivities, advertising lines, and the fears of a Cold War-era public. Walt's insistence that entertainment value be preserved even in propaganda was not a throwaway line. To him, it was a strategy. Keep the audience enchanted, and they will accept the message without resistance. In practice, that translated into meetings where generals argued over cadence and Walt countered with timing how a 3-frame pause before a punchline could neutralize critical reflection. The studio's prowess was now both artistic and technological, the ability to make dense political messaging feel playful. At the fringes of these choices stood human costs. Animators whose work was rerouted into training films watched friends' careers stall after loyalty investigations. A storyboard that once promised a name and credits could become a piece of evidence attached to a suspicion. Racial caricatures, meanwhile, were not merely aesthetic missteps, they mattered socially. The crows in Dumbo and the Siamese cats in Lady and the Tramp carried the weight of stereotypes out into cinemas worldwide. The studio's visual shorthand reinforced existing prejudices, choices that, whether conscious or shaped by the era's prevailing attitudes, contributed to a broader normalizing of racist imagery. If you learned Walt Disney as the kindly uncle who knew how to make children laugh, you learned a polished cut. There is another reel, flickering and half-concealed, where ambition, fear, and political expedience interplay. The question that hovers over these corridors is simple and persistent. When an artist becomes indispensable to statecraft, what happens to art? The answer is never tidy. It is built of lunches, memos, edits, and the uneasy moral compromises that follow a handshake. And those compromises, like ink on cells, leave stains that time does not easily wash away. Something in this machine was tense and fraught enough that, sooner or later, it would snap. The next segment looks at that snap, an inflection point where private arrangements and public imperatives collided with consequences no one could then fully calculate. The event that follows would not simply change Disney. It would change how animation could be used by states. You will see how an industry of play became an industry of persuasion and why that matters for what happens next. The moment of rupture had a date, the winter months after Pearl Harbor. It arrived not as a single headline, but as an accumulation of directives, requisitions, and reassignments. The studio that had produced cheerful shorts and experimental features was told to retool. Equipment schedules shifted. Soundstages were reassigned. Men and women who once joked about squash-ups at the commissary now talked about convoys, inventory lists, and briefing rooms. Imagine a soundstage emptied of its usual clutter. The smell of paint had been replaced by oil and the metallic tang of machine parts. A gurney of technicians moved through shadows where, weeks before, someone had been inking a Mickey Mouse expression. Army officers in regulation coats strode past pegboards labeled props for training reels. The transformation was both logistical and symbolic, a cultural factory becoming infrastructure for war. Operationally, the change was staggering. Over the course of several months, more than 400 films with military applications passed through Disney's gates. Simple classroom cartoons became manuals for complex procedures. Victory through air power, perhaps the most consequential of these projects, started as a cinematic argument about strategic bombing. It was not a training reel. It aimed to influence high policy. Adapted from a book by Major Alexander de Seversky, the film used animation to visualize aerial power in ways photograph or prose could not. It showed maps in motion, forces concentrating like weather systems, cities turning into targets on a grid. The language was clinical, but the effect was visceral. When Winston Churchill screened the film, the reaction was not merely artistic curiosity. According to several accounts, the imagery crystallized strategic. When populations see enemies depicted as grotesque dolls or vermin, the cognitive load of ethical hesitation eases. The studio's artistry made those representations compelling and shareable. It also made them durable. After the war, the frames they produced did not entirely vanish. They echoed in later works, in attitudes, and in the ways entire populations thought about distant peoples. The war years also tightened the nexus between the studio and intelligence agencies. Walt's regular contact with federal officials intensified. There are records of meetings, letters, and gifts exchanged. He was consulted on tone and technique. He testified in public hearings and, privately, shared names. In 1947, before WAC, Disney's cooperation extended to providing lists and materials. The ideological purges that followed blacklists, ruined careers, self-censorship were not solely the product of one studio or one man. They were the product of a culture that equated dissent with betrayal. But, crucially, Disney's cooperation had a practical impact. It supplied investigators with leads that rippled across the entertainment industry. The immediate human cost of this period is plain. Careers ended. Families moved away. Voices that might have contributed later to richer, more critical art were silenced. Some victims emigrated or left the field. Others attempted to survive by accepting lesser roles. The creative ecosystem was narrowed by fear. When storytellers are nervous about content, they self-edit. The result is an industry that rewards conformity, palatability, and the appearance of loyalty. The moral consequences were not only domestic. The studio's wartime output fed foreign audiences, too. The Office of War Information distributed reels that shaped perceptions in Allied and occupied territories. Allied propaganda sought both to demonize enemies and to reassure occupied populations of liberation motives. Disney's brand of animation trusted and familiar smoothed those messages. In occupied Europe, a cartoon could present liberation as an inevitable moral arc, minimizing the complex, painful realities of war and occupation. If you step back, the pattern becomes unnerving. A company that mastered childhood affect was now also shaping adult convictions on matters of life and death. The artistic techniques, pacing, character attachment, visual shorthand were identical whether produced for a child on a Saturday morning or a colonel in a briefing room. What changed was the target and the stakes. After the war, rather than retreat, Disney and his studio institutionalized lessons learned. Animation was no longer merely amusement. It was a modality of persuasion. Techniques refined for military efficacy were repurposed for peacetime influence. Whether in educational reels, promotional films, or later in the narrative arcs of family-friendly features, the tools remained. Emotional hooks, simplified moral binaries, and the authoritative voice of a trusted brand. The consequences of the wartime pivot reverberate beyond the immediate casualties. They shaped the very grammar of mid-century visual persuasion, creating a template others would copy. Governments learned that soft power could be manufactured and scaled. Corporations learned that narratives could be monetized as civic goods. Walt Disney, a man who had once been a student of gags and timing, had become a reliable technician of national sentiment. What followed was an industry determined to protect that newfound cultural capital. The struggle would shift from factories and soundstages to archives and classrooms. How do you hide an awkward past? How do you turn participation in state propaganda into a patriotic badge rather than a stain? Those were the questions that led directly to a campaign of narrative shaping that would outlast Walt himself, and that is the subject of the next section. After the last reel was spooled and the final banners for victory paraded through Main Street, a quieter operation began, the project of forgetting. It did not take the form of book burnings or public confessions. It was more patient, administrative, and therefore more durable. The studio converted its wartime prestige into a new kind of capital, cultural trust. And trust, once earned, is hard to dislodge. The first tool was authorship. Authorized biographies multiplied polished portraits that emphasized humility, inventiveness, and the mythic garage origin. Photographs were cropped to show a genial man sketching in sepia light. Memos, internal controversies, and lists of government contracts made their way into drawers labeled sensitive. Gradually, the public record was curated. The story that emerged was not false in its facts. It was incomplete by design. Television became the next instrument. Walt Disney Presents, and its successors placed Walt's image in living rooms across the country. He was broadcast as a genial host who guided viewers on tours of imagination. The series did something more insidious than entertain. It normalized one voice as the translator of cultural values. That voice, steady and grandfatherly, began to stand in for national values in the public imagination. The same Disney who had advised generals now taught children how to feel about American life. Physical spaces followed suit. Disneyland was not merely an amusement park, it was a manifesto in miniature. Main Street, USA, with its varnished storefronts and cheerful brass bands, presented an America scrubbed of labor disputes and racial tension. Frontierland offered sanitized frontier myths, courageous pioneers, manifest destiny without dispossession. The park's geography was designed for emotional clarity, not historical accuracy. Every scent of popcorn, every parade of costumed characters, every staged sunset at the park's edge worked to anchor an idealized narrative. The nation walked inside that narrative and, for many, left believing it had always been true. Control over archives further cemented the mythology. Access to private corporate records required permissions that were sometimes denied to independent scholars. Film prints vanished into vaults where only company historians or approved writers could consult them. When inconvenient materials resurfaced, they were often presented with framing commentary that minimized their stakes. The archive, once a place of raw evidence, became another tool for shaping memory. Legal power deepened the effect. Copyright and trademark enforcement were wielded to limit how critics could use Disney material. A contested image could be relegated to an expensive legal debate rather than a public reassessment. Lawsuits and legal threats do not change truth, but they change who can tell a counter-story without facing crippling costs. Over time, that silencing becomes part of the landscape. Certain lines of inquiry are intellectual dead ends because the energy and money required to pursue them are prohibitive. The company also leaned into institutional patronage. Museums, universities, and cultural centers received funding and exhibits that cast Walt and the studio in a philanthropic, innovative light. Grants funded research fellows whose work often aligned with institutional expectations. The result was an ecosystem where critical scholarship could be under-resourced while friendly narratives were amplified. In public plazas and museum catalogs, the smiling entrepreneur became an American exemplar. But propaganda is not merely about suppression, it's about substitution. The studio distributed alternative narratives that reclaimed wartime activity as patriotic necessity. Wartime films were recast as examples of civic duty. Collaborations with government were reframed as voluntary support in a time of national crisis. Over time, the distinction between voluntary patriotism and strategic alignment blurred. The public could accept an explanation that made uncomfortable choices understandable, even noble. The manufacturing of the myth also relied on cultural currency. Disney's symbols, Mickey's ears, the castle silhouette, the musical cues migrated into global vocabulary. Symbols are shortcuts. They carry bundles of meaning that bypass inquiry. A symbol of innocence is harder to interrogate than a footnote in an archive. That is the genius and danger of branding. When a corporation accumulates effective capital on a global scale, it can translate trust into ideological influence. This apparatus did not go unchallenged. Researchers, journalists, and former employees occasionally published divergent accounts. A few films were restored to public view. When generations grow up inside an aesthetic and moral frame, they inherit interpretive shortcuts. They know to feel awe at certain images, to laugh at certain gags, to trust a particular narrator. Those habits of mind function as cognitive filters. They make it harder to see alternate frames, to entertain discomforting evidence. The machinery of myth becomes, in effect, a teacher of blind spots. Does this mean Walt Disney was a conspirator who sat at a table and mapped global persuasion? No. Likely, he was a man of many impulses, artist, businessman, patriot, and strategist who found in animation a medium of unusual power. His genius was partly technical and partly political. He saw how imagination could be harnessed to practical ends. The company that bears his name learned how to polish that harness until it glittered like a crown. The lesson for viewers is unsettling because it cuts against a comforting intuition that entertainment is merely respite. The case studied here shows the opposite. Storytelling can be a vector of influence, and influence matters. If we care about democratic deliberation, if we care about historical truth, we must ask what else has been wrapped in the packaging of delight. If we do not, the next generation will receive an inheritance of images without the keys to interpret them. As you step back from this dossier, the final question is not about a single man's morality. It is about systems. Who writes memory? Who polices archives? Who profits from simplified narratives? And how we, as consumers of culture, let amusement substitute for inquiry. The mechanism Disney perfected still hums today. It delights, and in delight it persuades. The only remedy is curiosity and insistence to look closer, to read the footnotes, to listen for the pauses where the camera cuts away. If you keep watching, more doors will open. The next doors are not in Walt's past. They're in the stories you accept as truth now. When the polished stories end and the footnotes begin, a different Walt Disney appears, less a one-dimensional mascot of wholesome innocence and more a figure of layered contradiction. He is not a cartoon villain drawn in black ink, nor is he a saint painted in gold leaf. He is, in the most honest reconstruction, a practical visionary, an artist with instincts for spectacle and timing, and a businessman with an appetite for influence. He loved invention and hated uncertainty. He believed in order and in the power of a clear narrative. And he understood, perhaps better than anyone in his industry, that the feelings you create in an audience can be more persuasive than the facts you present to them. Start with character. The public myth frames him as a gentle showman's soft eyes, steady voice, a kindly hand resting on a child's shoulder. Behind closed doors he was sharper. Colleagues remembered a man capable of explosive anger. He liked control. He disliked unpredictability. You can imagine him in his office, the desk perfectly arranged, a storyboard rolled out like a map. He watched animators, not merely as collaborators, but as instruments to be directed. When he praised, his praise was a currency. When he scorned, the silence that followed felt like punishment. This is not mere gossip. It is the texture of a workplace where power and art collided every morning. That temperament had consequences. It produced great work attention to detail, relentless editing, sequences scrubbed until timing felt inevitable. But it also produced scapegoats. When animators organized and left to demand better pay, Walt did not merely negotiate. He mobilized authorities, called in police, and in some accounts, pointed to leaders as dangerous elements. To him, the studio was not an atelier where every voice carried equal weight. It was a machine, and he was the engineer who expected loyalty. This is the human cost behind many of the smiles audiences saw on screen. Motivation is harder to pin down, yet clearer in its effects. He was driven by multiple, sometimes competing impulses. Part artistic ambition. He wanted to stretch animation beyond its cheap gag reputation and into spectacle. Part entrepreneurial hunger. He wanted to secure markets, sponsors, and stable growth. Part ideological conviction. He had a distinct view of American life, a picture of order, family, and national pride that he believed deserved to be amplified. These strands braided together into decisions that were neither purely aesthetic nor purely commercial. When war came, those impulses found a single, powerful outlet. He embraced government work not as a reluctant supplier, but as a collaborator. Records of his meetings with military and intelligence officials show a man who did not merely accept directives, he translated them into cinematic terms. He argued that persuasion required craftsmanship, structure, character, rhythm. He insisted that even a training film must satisfy as a story. That insistence produced memorable films that were efficient and elegant in their construction. It also produced films that carried a moral clarity that simplified complex realities into iconography. To reduce that to "he was hired by the government" misses the point. He saw an opportunity and took it, and he helped design how a nation would see itself and its enemies. His methods deserve close attention because they became templates. He learned how to bind effect to idea. He would take a lovable character, the duck, the mouse, and place it in situations that made an audience feel a specific way. Righteous anger, righteous fear, righteous contempt. The technique is simple to describe and devastating in its effect. You invest emotionally in the character. Then the character directs that investment. When Donald Duck is humiliated by a caricatured enemy, the viewer's laugh is invested with moral judgment. The laugh becomes alignment. Alignment becomes consent. Disney experimented with tonal calibration, where to make an audience laugh, where to shock, where to linger on sorrow. These control points are where persuasion lives. It is important to mark what is agreed upon and what remains contested. Historians debate the degree to which victory through air power changed strategic bombing doctrine. Some argue that the film crystallized existing currents of thinking among leaders. Others see it as one influential visual argument among many. The film did, however, offer a powerful image system, maps in motion, fleets as mechanical organisms, cities reduced to grids. That visual argument made certain strategies thinkable. Whether it alone altered policy is arguable. What is less arguable is that it offered a way of seeing that eased the moral labor of decision-makers. A map that animates destruction as efficient logistics removes some of the human friction from ordering mass violence. His techniques extended into darker territories. Short propaganda cartoons like Der Führer's Face and Education for Death were not merely satire. They were acts of rhetorical exclusion. They relied on caricature, on exaggeration of features and behavior, to collapse an enemy into a moral caricature. The effect is well documented. Dehumanization reduces the psychological barriers to violence. This is not to say every wartime film should be judged identical or that every audience reacted the same way. But the frames Disney created entered a public imagination already primed for simplification and did so with humor's anesthetic. There is moral complexity here. Some of these films rallied a populace to resist genuinely violent, genocidal regimes. They mobilized resources and morale in a period where survival seemed at stake. Yet they did so by trading nuance for clarity, empathy for blunt allegory. Looking back, those trade-offs look consequential. The same tools that rallied people against Hitler could be tuned to justify less defensible policies, racialized violence, imperial overreach, suppression of dissent. That slippery slope is not a leap of logic. It is a consequence of the potency of emotional framing. Another axis of Walt's life that complicates the portrait is his relationship with collaborators. He was, by many accounts, generous in supporting some employees, personally invested in their success. He could be paternal, mentoring certain creatives and backing projects that others thought too risky. At the same time, the studio system under him exploited talent. Many artists worked long hours, received limited credit, and saw their names vanish into collective titles. The myth of the solitary genius, the man at the drawing board, obscures those who actually made the animation sing. He was ambitious and protective of his creation. He was generous and punitive. He could be tender in public, ferocious in private. Those contradictions made him effective and, at times, dangerous. If there is one through line, it is the cultivation of trust. He built a brand that felt safe and reliable. People trusted the worlds he made. They associated his name with comfort. That trust was a resource he could draw on. When the government asked for help, the studio's brand made its messages feel less like orders and more like guidance. That made the propaganda more palatable, more effective. It also made the studio a custodial force over a cultural memory, deciding which stories belonged to public life and which could be deferred, buried, or quietly edited. This honest reconstruction does not erase his achievements. Many of the techniques he refined, the orchestration of sound and image, the pacing of emotion, the creation of immersive environments, remain milestones in cinematic craft. The genius of certain sequences, the innovation of synchronizing music and movement, the sheer ambition of projects like full-length animation and theme parks are real. But placed in context, those achievements look less like apolitical breakthroughs and more like calibrated instruments. They were technical masterstrokes and also tools that could be aligned with power. Finally, this portrait allows us to ask a sharper question. If someone can make joy serve policy, what does that imply about the systems that reward such alignment? Walt Disney's life demonstrates a pattern where aesthetic skill becomes political leverage, where entertainment becomes a vector for persuasion. He wasn't the inventor of that pattern. Modern politics and advertising would find similar techniques elsewhere. But he showed how intimate and effective that merger could be. The honest portrait leaves us with unease, not the satisfaction of a villain exposed, but the discomfort of recognition. The magic tricks work because they are beautiful. That beauty can be put to many ends. We move on now, not to ask whether he was a monster or a saint, those binaries collapse under scrutiny, but to ask how the machinery he helped forge still turns. If the studio could make propaganda that felt like bedtime story and make forgetting the default, then the problem is less about one man's choices and more about the cultural conditions that let a story so easily become the story. The shadow that Walt Disney left is not a single picture, but a set of structures, practices, institutions, and habits of attention that survive him. They are the subtle mechanics by which stories become authorities and authorities become comfortable. To see their present-day consequences, follow three strands: politics and soft power, markets, brands, and legal levers, and cultural memory, how we choose what to forget. Begin with politics. The Disney method is not a direct line from one film to another. It is a grammar. Use melody to lock in feeling. Use recurring symbols to create shorthand. Use characters to embody values. Politicians learn this grammar quickly. Campaigns now emphasize biographical vignettes, cinematic ads, and emotionally charged moments over policy detail. Commercial strategists call it narrative persuasion. Speechwriters call it softening. Historians call it cultural framing. Regardless of lexicon, the effect is consistent. An electorate given a rhythm of carefully packaged emotional cues will often respond with alignment rather than deliberation. Look at wartime rhetoric. Governments still employ cultural production to legitimate action. Films, documentaries, and curated social media collide into a single stream that accretes public feeling. Diplomatic agencies commission media to normalize policy choices abroad. The tools are the same. Emotive music, human-scale stories, recurring archetypes. Where once Disney animated a bombing map to make a strategy legible, modern studios animate rescue narratives and tales of liberation to make interventions feel inevitable and necessary. The moral calculus is seldom spelled out. Instead, we are asked to feel the answer. This merges seamlessly with corporate power. Disney's company has become a conglomerate whose reach extends to franchises Marvel, Star Wars, Pixar, National Geographic, and to distribution platforms that insert content into daily life. When a multinational negotiates with a foreign government to gain market access, the calculus resembles wartime diplomacy as much as it does commerce. Studios edit, redact, or withhold elements to secure releases in lucrative territories. The choices are pragmatic, preserve profit and audience size. Yet these edits shape the cultural texture in those markets. When scenes are removed or altered to satisfy authoritarian sensibilities, the narratives circulating there are subtly different, less likely to challenge certain power structures, less likely to normalize dissent. That is influenced by omission. Laws and legal pressure are another quiet lever. The studio's aggressive protection of its intellectual property serves multiple ends. It secures revenue and, importantly, it controls the reproduction of images and stories that could be recontextualized to critique power. Copyright and trademark enforcement can turn a historical question into a legal headache. Want to show a wartime cartoon in full to analyze it? Permission, licensing, potential litigation stand between you and the footage. That friction shapes scholarship and journalism. Contested archives become costly to contest. Over time, scarcity of access ossifies collective memory. If only a small set of curated materials is available, that curated set becomes, effectively, the record. The archive is itself a political artifact. Corporate-controlled vaults, restricted access, carefully framed exhibitions, these are not neutral practices. They are acts of cultural triage. The Disney Family Museum, company-funded exhibits, and produced documentaries have curated an image of Walt as an innovator and benevolent caretaker of childhood. Alternative narratives, wartime contracts, FBI collaboration, or racialized caricatures are relegated to footnotes, academic monographs with limited circulation, or locked reels. The power to open or close access is, arguably, the most consequential soft power of all. It decides which things are seen under bright studio lights and which are left in a dim basement. There is a social psychological dimension to all of this. People learn not only from explicit teaching, but from effective habits. The things we feel safe with, the voices we recognize as trustworthy. Disney's brand cultivated trust as a social habit. Families gather around certain stories, rituals form around them, and generational memory consolidates. That trust is valuable. It reduces friction for new narratives. A company with established trust can introduce new messages and expect lower resistance. That is precisely what made wartime animation so potent. A trusted style bearing difficult messages. This dynamic is visible in current branding across industries. Corporations do not only sell products, they sell identities and moral signals. The language of corporate social responsibility, cause marketing and values alignment, leans on the same principle. When you feel good about a brand, you accept its framing of issues. Brands sponsor public institutions, fund research, and endow chairs. Cultural institutions with corporate backing selectively amplify certain narratives and mute others. The landscape of trustworthy voices becomes concentration-owned. That concentration transforms public conversation by narrowing the range of acceptable frames. The commercial logic and the state logic have, in many modern contexts, become cooperative. Tech platforms amplify emotionally resonant content faster than any studio of the past could. Viral videos, algorithmically prioritized, distill complex issues into a few seconds of effect. The result, a culture that privileges condensation over complexity, spectacle over nuance. That is the digital echo of the Disney insight. Make the feeling first, and people will rationalize the rest. At the level of everyday life, Disney's techniques also shape how we teach history. Textbooks and classroom curricula frequently borrow the language of narrative simplicity. Classroom films and materials, some produced by educational arms of major corporations or funded by friendly donors, tend to favor clear moral arcs that delight and reassure. This can be useful. Stories make information memorable, but it can also be reductive. Complex histories of empire to undo, that is, to contest the invisible grammar of how we imagine certain groups, a task that requires more than editing a film. It requires reconstructing a vocabulary of attention. Yet the legacy is not monolithic or totalizing. There are zones of resistance and revision. Scholars, archivists, and activists have recovered and recontextualized problematic works. Streaming platforms sometimes place warnings and historical notes alongside older content. Some exhibitions explicitly address harmful imagery, opening a public conversation. Lawsuits can be resisted. Archives can be pried open. Cultural memory can be reoriented where there is will and resources. Still, we must be honest about asymmetry. The corporate and legal apparatuses that polish the Disney myth are robust, well-funded, and global. Countervailing efforts, independent scholarship, grassroots activism, critical pedagogy often work with less money and access. This asymmetry means that sanitized narratives tend to propagate faster than corrective ones. A crucial contemporary mechanism is content normalization for foreign markets. When studios alter narratives to appease foreign censors or market norms, they are not merely performing a business calculation. They are reshaping the global cultural commons. A film scene in Beijing may have different dialogue, different gestures, fewer scenes that critique the state. The result is that audiences in different contexts experience divergent moral worlds delivered under the same brand. That divergence matters. It means a global franchise can carry multiple, sometimes contradictory, moral grammars, each optimized for a particular polity. The technical capacities to make such edits, digital remastering, alternate cuts, targeted regional releases are far beyond what mid-century propagandists imagined. But the principle is the same. Adapt the story to the audience to lower resistance. The modern corporation's stewardship of history takes another form. The selective restoration of certain works and the continued sequestration of others. Films that fit the sanitized brand receive careful restoration, lavish releases, commentary tracks, and marketing. Footage that exposes uncomfortable cooperation with power or that depicts dehumanizing propaganda remains archived, sometimes accessible only to accredited researchers. The cultural consequence is distributional. The stories we are invited to revisit are those that flatter the brand and the nation. The stories that do not fit are left in storage. Over time, the archive itself validates a preferred narrative. The result of these combined dynamics is an ecosystem in which influence is distributed not only by force or law, but by taste, habit, and convenience. When power leverages aesthetics, people often acquiesce because the path of least resistance is pleasurable. The theater of consensus is not only political, it is sensorial. Pop music, theme parks, streaming platforms, and textbooks together create a pattern of feeling that shapes public life as much as any policy debate. That pattern produces real-world consequences. Public support for interventions framed as rescue. Reduced empathy for adversaries depicted as cartoons. Narrowed debate around labor and corporate accountability when institutions that sanitize history also fund the cultural venues that shape civic trust. The legacy is less a single text than a grammar of influence that favors simplicity and emotional resonance over contested complexity. Finally, the hidden legacy is personal. Think of parenting. A generation grows up with certain melodies associated with comfort and moral clarity. Those emotional cues stick. They become templates for how to read the world. A child who learned to trust a specific brand's voice may carry that trust into adult life. approaching complex issues with a predisposition to accept the frames that feel familiar. That is the quiet power of effective propaganda. It is pedagogical across decades. Is all of this malicious design? Not always. Many decisions are pragmatic. Markets matter. Audiences prefer coherence. Governments seek allies. But when pragmatic choices systematically privilege simplified narratives, and when the power to shape those narratives is concentrated, the result is civic flattening. The world becomes easier to feel about and harder to think through. Which brings us back to the essential wager. We value entertainment because it soothes. We need public reasoning because it complicates. The danger is not entertainment per se, but a culture where entertainment substitutes for inquiry. When delight becomes a heuristic for truth, forgetting becomes an easy default. That is the enduring, hidden legacy Walt Disney helped refine. Not only how stories are told, but how easily we let storytelling become our substitute for understanding. You have followed the thread from glossy myth to complicated man, from wartime reels to the contemporary media empire. You saw how skill in making people feel can be repurposed as a political tool. Now ask yourself, if the most persuasive propaganda hides in the place where you go to relax, then how many of your convictions were shaped by satisfaction rather than argument? Thank you for watching this investigation to the end. If you want more dossiers that peel back stories you learned as tidy truths, subscribe and help us reach the first 1,000 supporters. This channel is small, and every new viewer helps fund access to archives and research we otherwise cannot afford. Tell us in the comments, where did you first learn to trust a story, and which stories do you now question? The next file in this series will open another archive. Keep watching. There is more to unearth.